Released in 2022, the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus were minimal upgrades to the iPhone 13, bringing only some minor improvements but still making for some really great smartphones. And in 2025, the iPhone 14 line has been officially discontinued by Apple, with the new iPhone 16e replacing them outright at the same price point of $600 US. Even so, the iPhone 14 may still remain available from some retailers and carriers, potentially on clearance, so long as supplies last. And you could always look to purchase the phone used or refurbished. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and with these phones approaching 3 years old, I think it's a good time to ask the question, is the iPhone 14 still worth it in 2025? Is this a phone that still holds up well and will last you a number of years? Well, yeah, I think it can be worth it even though it's no longer being sold by Apple, and I want to talk about both the good and the bad of the iPhone 14 and where it stands at this point. This video will apply to both size options of the phone, which have no differences, aside from the Plus obviously being bigger with a 6.7-inch display versus 6.1 inches, and you will see better battery life on the larger phone thanks to the bigger size. Aside from that, these two phones are identical and I just have a normal sized iPhone 14 here. Earlier this year, I did do a video on the 14, but of course with the 16e replacing it in Apple's lineup, it did feel necessary to do an updated review. Much of what we'll talk about is going to remain the same, with the main difference coming down to how you purchase this phone. Again, you may be able to find remaining inventory from some retailers, but I probably wouldn't buy the 14 unless you're getting a pretty great deal. The 16e is only $600 US and brings a lot of improvements over the 14, particularly in performance and battery life, while looking nearly identical. It does only have one camera lens, but it is the upgraded 48 megapixel sensor versus the 12 megapixel wide and ultra wide on the 14. Personally, I would prefer to have the single higher quality lens, but if you do really enjoy that ultra wide, it's likely the biggest benefit of the iPhone 14 over the 16e. The other big benefit is that, at least in theory, the iPhone 14 or even 14 Plus should be purchasable for potentially significantly less money than the 16e, and whether or not the savings are enough to sway you one way or another comes down to the individual. But hopefully this video will at least give you an impression of how the 14 holds up in 2025. It is still a really solid smartphone, and it's essentially just a slightly faster iPhone 13. We will talk a little bit more about the similarities with the 13 later on, which itself is a great phone and maybe even more worth buying if you're looking at the second-hand market. But this is still a very premium, sleek iPhone with powerful hardware and great cameras, making for an all-around really strong experience in 2025, and this will continue to be the case for multiple more years. I've got my full iPhone buying guide where I go a bit more in depth comparing it to other iPhone models in the description if you want to check that out, but for now let's take a closer look at the phone I'm holding here in my hand. The base design of the iPhone 14 is identical to the iPhone 13, with a glossy glass back, diagonally oriented dual cameras, an aluminum frame, and we do have a number of nice colors to choose from. Being that this phone is glass, you'll definitely want to use a case, as both the front and the back of the phone can absolutely shatter if you have an unlucky drop. From the front, the 14 is again identical to the 13 with a reduced notch size, thin bezels, and a gorgeous high-resolution OLED display running at 60 Hz. If you're in the US, you won't have a SIM tray on this phone, it's eSIM only, although in other countries like Canada, where I am, we do still have a SIM tray, as well as eSIM compatibility, which is nice. If you're in the US, most carriers will support eSIM, but it's worth looking into just in case they don't. Again, we do have the lightning port on the bottom for charging. Not having USB-C here is another thing that may not feel like a big deal for some, especially if you already have an abundance of lightning cables you'd like to continue using, but if you do get the 15 or above, you're looking at USB-C instead, which I would personally prefer. The phone feels really good in the hand. It's solid, not too heavy, and just feels premium. Apple makes nice looking phones, and the 14 is no exception. Having the notch instead of the dynamic island also really isn't the most major compromise out there. I do really like the dynamic island as it offers easy media controls and some slick functionality, but it's not a life-changing feature, and the notch actually can feel a little less intrusive at times, like when watching video at a 2:1 aspect ratio. We of course have Face ID for unlocking the device, and it works really well as it always has. The iPhone 16e also looks identical to the iPhone 14 from the front, which in turn makes this phone feel even more modern than it already does. Heck, you wouldn't even be able to tell the two phones apart until you flip them over to the back. There's IP68 water resistance here, wireless charging, fast charging if you have the right brick, and MagSafe for that magnetic wireless charging, which is always a nice feature. Let's talk about the cameras, which are always going to be an important part of any smartphone, and while the 14 didn't do a whole lot to improve quality over the 13, it can still absolutely hold its own. The front-facing selfie camera is a solid 12 megapixels, capable of fine selfies, nothing out of the norm. The lens itself is a bit bigger, allowing for slightly better selfies than the 13, and we also have autofocus rather than just a fixed focus that's on previous models. Then there's the dual lens setup on the back with a 12 megapixel wide lens and 12 megapixel ultra wide, giving some solid versatility in how we can take photos and either zoom 0.5 times zoom or 1 time zoom. That wide lens did get a bit bigger, which should allow for slightly better photos, particularly in low light compared to the 13, though the differences in real life usage are going to be pretty minimal. Again, the iPhone 16e doesn't have that ultra wide lens, which does give the 14 a little bit extra versatility, though with the 48 megapixel Fusion camera, you do get 1x and 2x zoom on the 16e, so it sort of balances out. Just because of the 48 megapixels, I would prefer the 16e's setup personally, but the 14 is still plenty capable of holding its own, and having the ultra wide, it is pretty nice. These cameras are certainly nothing special by 2025 standards, but the reality here is that smartphone cameras have been good for a long time now, so something like this is still fully able to take great photos in the right conditions, and even in some not so ideal situations like with poor lighting, the 14 still manages to hold its own. There's a definite jump up if you compare this to like the iPhone 16 or 16 Pro, but it's not so significant that I would be concerned about it from the perspective of someone who wants a solid camera but doesn't need all the bells and whistles you would get on a newer and, even more crucially, far more expensive iPhone. These photos are great, and the camera is more than enough to capture moments and memories, which is really what you want. Video can be filmed at up to 4K at 60 frames per second, and it looks really good, as you would expect. All in all, the iPhone 14 camera is still really great, and nothing to worry about if you're using or buying this phone. Yes, going to the iPhone 15 or the 16 is going to be a bit better, but in my opinion, the quality here is still more than acceptable, and that won't be changing in the coming years. Ultimately, a lot of what the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus bring to the table can be boiled down to the fact that everything really is more than acceptable, and in fact is really good, whether it be the cameras, the hardware, the design, whatever you're looking at. Battery life is typically pretty solid, particularly on the Plus models, so as long as the battery is still healthy, once it gets close to the 80% mark, you'll be noticing downgraded performance, and may want to go through Apple to get it replaced altogether, but assuming a healthy battery, you can reliably expect a full day of usage out of this phone, unless maybe you're really pushing it by doing some heavy gaming or streaming a lot of video throughout the day, and even then you can just make sure you have a charger nearby and you should be good to go. The hardware here is also very much acceptable. This is still a very fast phone, as you would expect given Apple was only just recently still charging $600 for it. It'll handle any task you throw at it with ease thanks to the A15 Bionic chipset and 6GB of RAM, and I would be expecting iOS updates through to at least 2028 if not longer. This is where things do get a little bit messy though. Thing is, the iPhone 13, a phone released a full year earlier than the 14, not only looks identical, but also has the A15 chip. Except the 14 has the chip from the iPhone 13 Pro, which basically added a single GPU core. There's also a couple extra gigs of RAM on the 14 over the 13, which is a much more significant upgrade, as it does ensure better performance in the long term, as well as an all-round better experience with things like more apps staying open in the background for longer. I would also say the 14 probably gets an extra year of software support over the 13. Even so, this was a really disappointing upgrade in 2022, and if you're on an iPhone 12 or 13 right now, I would definitely want to aim a little higher to the iPhone 16e. That phone really does present some solid value right now, being the same price the 14 was. It brings the A18 chip, as well as Apple Intelligence, USB-C, you have the 48 megapixel camera, and basically the same display and body as the iPhone 14. Battery life is also crazy good on that phone. We're talking 20 hours of video playback for the 14 versus 26 hours for the 16e. Heck, even the iPhone 16 only gets 22 hours of video playback. That's quite the jump for a device actually $200 cheaper than the iPhone 16 and $100 cheaper than the iPhone 15, which I don't think is at all worth it brand new anymore at $700. Is the iPhone 14 still worth buying? Yes, it absolutely can be, if you're finding a good deal, probably on the used market. If we turn to eBay.com, I was finding the 14 with 128 gigs around $300 to $350. The Plus will obviously be more, and generally I would say the Plus probably isn't worth it when you could instead put that money towards something like a 16e. But the 14 with good battery health is still a really solid smartphone in 2025, and will continue to remain that way for the foreseeable future. And I do think it's worth that few $100 right now. The iPhone 13, of course, is very similar and a bit cheaper, and again, my iPhone buying guide will be linked in the description below if you want more details on some of your options. I will also mention that Apple's refurbished section does sometimes have the iPhone 14 available, but it's not exactly a great deal there. While buying their refurbished products is nice as you're getting practically a brand new device, the 14 is costing $529 US, so basically $70 less than the 16e, and that's not at all worth it when you get so much more with that 16e. Definitely stick to the used market, or make sure you're getting a heck of a deal on a 14 if you are buying from a carrier or retailer. I personally probably wouldn't spend more than $450 on one of these brand new, and even then, I think I'd prefer to go up to the 16E. But all in all, as a whole package, the iPhone 14 is a great device, and that isn't going to be changing anytime soon. Whether or not it's the right iPhone for you is a little harder for me to say, as it comes down to your own individual needs and preferences, but I do think if you're using this phone right now or end up buying it, you won't regret it. It's still, in the very least, a fast, reliable smartphone that'll get the job done and serve you well for the next 2 to 3 years, if not longer. It's the phone my grandparents use, my dad uses. It's just a solid iPhone, and I do recommend it at the right deal. So with that, I think I'm right about done here. If you found this video interesting or helpful, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content. Again, this was an updated version of my previous iPhone 14 review, which I'll probably just unlist after posting this one. No doubt this is horrible for the almighty YouTube algorithm, but such is life, I suppose. You can help me out by hitting that like button and maybe comment your thoughts down below. Are any of you using the iPhone 14 right now? How do you like it? But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.